Using similar considerations, our technique can provide a solution to a clinical question encountered when performing scar revision. We occasionally need to treat this kind of scar, where hard scar tissue is interrupted by soft tissue, by a soft part. This structure is similar to two islands in the sea. The islands correspond to hard scars, and the sea corresponds to soft tissue in between. When performing scar revision for this kind of scars, the operation can be done in two different ways. In the first method, hard island part and the soft sea part in between are removed together. Then the wound is sutured. Let's call this method total revision. In the other method, only hard parts are removed. The soft part in between is left unremoved. Let's call this method partial revision. Simulating each of the two methods, we produced two models. The scar is simulated by replacing part of the skin with hard tissues, indicated here with blue. In the total revision model, the hard part consists of one long piece. In the partial revision model, the hard part consists of two separated pieces. Simulating body movement, the upper ends of the models are fixed and the lower ends are pulled downward. This is the result. These pictures indicate the distribution patterns of the stresses occurring during body movement. Higher stress occurred around the scar in total revision. This means that the fibroblasts are more likely to be mechanically stimulated in total revision than in partial revision. This further means that hypertrophy is more likely to recur after total revision than after partial revision. So the soft tissue between hard scars, the part compared to the sea, should not be removed in revising the scars. Therefore, to avoid hypertrophy, partial revision is recommended rather than total revision. We published this experiment and theory in Medical Hypothesis in 2015. Structural analysis is also useful to avoid risks in craniofacial surgery. I believe most people in this room know about LUFO-3 osteotomy. However, I would guess there aren't so many people who have actually done LUFO-3 osteotomy. Why? Because LUFO-3 osteotomy is notoriously risky. Very serious complications such as subarachnoid hemorrhage, cavernous sinus fistula, and blindness are reported as complications after LUFO-3 osteotomy. All doctors hate to encounter such complications, so various studies have been conducted seeking to avoid these complications. For instance, Akita and Mitsukawa performed experimental LUFO-3 osteotomy on cadavers and found that incomplete separation of pterygomaxillary junction can cause serious complications. About 15 years ago, I witnessed complication of an operation by one of my colleagues. In that case, blindness occurred after LUFO-3 osteotomy for a patient with Crouzon disease. I suspected the complication was caused by incomplete separation of the orbital wall. So I conducted a study to clarify whether or not incomplete separation of the orbital floor increases risks in LUFO-3 osteotomy. First, I produced 10 10 three-dimensional skull models replicating the skulls of 10 persons, referring to their computer tomography data. For these 10 skull models, we simulated osteotomy for the nasal radix frontal process of the diagoma and pterygium axillary junction. The orbital floor was cut in 4 different ways. In the first way, both the lateral and medial walls were cut. In the second way, the medial wall was left uncut. In the third way, the lower half of the medial wall was left uncut. In the fourth way, the lateral wall was left uncut. The facial cranium remained connected to the neurocranium at the orbital walls. So, fracture should occur in the orbit when performing down fracture. The issue is that the orbit might present different fracture patterns depending on how the orbital floor was cut. This is easy to understand by referring to this analogy. Suppose we have a piece of chocolate. If we fold one side of it and bend it, it might break, as shown with the yellow zigzag line. However, if we fold the same chocolate at different lines, it will break in different ways. So, in down fracturing, the orbit should break differently depending on how osteotomy of the orbital floor was performed. These differences are what we want to know. We performed dynamic simulation of down fracture for the 10 models, varying the separation patterns of the orbital walls. This movie shows an example simulation. For each simulation case, we observed the optic canal to determine whether or not it was damaged in down fracture. In this case, the optic canal is involved in fracture, meaning if we conduct L4-3 osteotomy for the owner of this skull, the optic canal is likely to be damaged and blindness might occur. For each of the 4 types of osteotomy, we evaluated the frequency of optic canal damage. For type 1 to type 3, nothing happened with any of the 10 skull models. However, for type 4 osteotomy, with 4 out of 10 skulls, the optic canal developed fracture. These findings demonstrate that incomplete separation of the lateral wall can be a causative factor of optic canal injury in down fracturing, potentially leading to blindness. Therefore, we conclude that to avoid blindness, complete separation of the lateral orbital wall is strongly recommended. Incomplete separation of the lateral wall must be avoided because optic canal fracture may result. Structural analysis is also useful for cosmetic surgery of the ear. As an instance, here we introduce how we use our technique for the treatment of prominent ears, a deformity that can be associated with an alien-like appearance. To correct the prominent ears, stitches are applied to the ear cartilage. This technique is called mustard suture, after the surgeon who invented the technique. This is a schematic description of mustard suture. Stitches are applied to the auricular cartilage. Tying the threads decreases the prominence of the auricular cartilage. The issue is where we should apply the stitches. Should we apply them in the upper part or lower part of the auricular cartilage, or in between? Before deciding the positions, how many stitches should we apply in the first places? 3, 2, or 1? Depending on the number of stitches and the positions they are applied to, the auricle presents different shapes as shown in these figures. Furthermore, through equally named prominent ears, the shape of the ear differs from patient to patient. So there aren't absolute rules for deciding how to apply mustard sutures. Tailor-made planning is needed for each patient, taking the patient's ear shape into consideration. Our technique is useful in doing such tailor-made planning. We scan patients' ears and make three-dimensional computer simulation models. Then we simulate the operation, varying the number of stitches and the locations in which they are applied. This is a lateral view of such simulation. This is an inferior view of the simulation. This preoperative planning requires an additional job of about 1 to 2 hours. But through such effort, we can provide our patients with improved outcomes. We reported this trial in plastic and reconstructive surgery in 2009. Now, let me start summarizing today's presentation. I want you to know that in the field of industry, there is a technique called structural analysis. With this technique, the dynamic behaviors of objects can be predicted by computer simulation. In our daily clinical practices, we often need to predict the patient's body shapes in response to forces. These situations include such treatments as operation for chest deformity, treatment of zygoma fractures, treatment of keloids, scar lesion, maxillofacial surgery, and cosmetic surgery on ears. Although I introduced a limited number of examples in today's presentation, I emphasize that structural analysis is a very useful tool in the practice of plastic surgery. Thank you for listening. ゆっくりやったら読